Chuck Calhoun loved the solitude of the hunt. Growing up in Seattle, Washington, he had spent countless weekends hiking through the misty forests of the Pacific Northwest, his boots crunching over mossy trails. Seattle's rain-washed skyline and evergreen wilderness were part of his soul, and while the constant drizzle often kept others indoors, it gave Chuck a sense of peace. His family joked that he was half man, half cedar tree. So, when his old friend Marcus invited him on a hunting trip in New York's Adirondack Mountains, Chuck was eager to trade one forest for another. He flew across the country, carrying only his rifle and a small pack of essentials. The plan was simple: spend a day tracking deer, enjoy the crisp autumn air, and maybe come home with a trophy. The forest was strikingly beautiful. Red and gold leaves blanketed the ground, and a gentle rain pattered against the canopy, creating a symphony of sound. The air smelled earthy and rich, and the occasional burst of sunlight through the clouds cast long shadows on the damp ground. By late afternoon, Chuck and Marcus had wandered far from their truck, their boots slick with mud. The forest was unusually quiet, though neither of them remarked on it at first. They'd seen a few signs of deer, broken branches, fresh tracks, but no luck so far. The quiet wasn't entirely unpleasant. It reminded Chuck of the stillness after a heavy Seattle rain, the kind that made the world feel freshly washed. "Let's set up camp here," Marcus said, gesturing to a small clearing. "We'll pick up the trail again tomorrow morning." They built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth. The drizzle had lessened, but the air was cold, and the flames cast flickering shadows on the trees. Chuck leaned back against a fallen log, thinking about his family. He pictured his dad teaching him to clean his first fish on the docks of Puget Sound, his mom pulling fresh loaves of bread from the oven, the kitchen filled with warmth on rainy days. Those memories made him smile. As the fire burned lower, Chuck thought back to the YouTube videos he'd watched before the trip. Cryptid stories fascinated him, accounts of strange creatures lurking in the woods. He'd seen everything from supposed Bigfoot sightings to grainy footage of unidentified creatures moving unnaturally fast. It was entertainment, nothing more. But here, in the middle of nowhere, the idea felt less far-fetched. A snapping branch broke the silence. Both men froze. "What was that?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Chuck's eyes scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. "Probably a deer," he said, but the words sounded unconvincing, even to himself. The noise came again, closer this time, a deliberate, heavy step. Chuck reached for his rifle, his heart pounding. The firelight didn't penetrate far into the trees, but he caught a glimpse of something. Eyes. Reflective, unblinking, and too high off the ground to belong to a deer. "Do you see that?" Chuck whispered. "Yeah," Marcus said. "What the hell is it?" The eyes disappeared, and the forest fell silent again. The men didn't move for what felt like an eternity, staring into the blackness. Then a sound came, a guttural, low growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Whatever it is, it's big," Marcus said, his voice shaking. Before they could react, the creature attacked. It moved with terrifying speed, crashing through the undergrowth toward them. Chuck barely had time to raise his rifle before Marcus was thrown backward, disappearing into the trees. Chuck fired blindly, the muzzle flash illuminating the creature for a split second. Its form was hulking, humanoid but wrong, with elongated limbs and a featureless face. Then it was gone, the forest swallowing it whole. He scrambled to his feet, shouting Marcus's name, but there was no answer. The fire had been scattered in the chaos, and the clearing was plunged into near-total darkness. Chuck knew he couldn't stay. Grabbing his pack and rifle, he headed toward the truck. The rain had picked up again, soaking his clothes and making the ground slippery. His flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the downpour but revealing nothing beyond the trees. The forest felt alive, every shadow and rustle threatening to reveal the creature. He could hear it pacing him, count its heavy steps mirroring his own. The rain muffled the sounds, but the occasional growl reminded him it was still there. Hours later, Chuck found a small overhang of rock and lit a makeshift fire. He had no choice but to stop. His legs were trembling from exhaustion, and he couldn't navigate the forest in complete darkness. The creature stayed just out of sight, its presence a constant weight on his mind. Chuck's thoughts drifted to his family again. His sister's infectious laugh, his dad's calm demeanor. Would they ever know what happened to him? Would he become one of those stories on YouTube? A cryptid victim, his disappearance chalked up to the wilderness? Morning came slowly, the rain easing but the cold biting. Chuck forced himself to keep moving, following the faint trail back to the truck. The creature attacked again, just as he reached the edge of the forest, lunging from the trees with a bone-chilling scream. Chuck fired his last shot, and the creature retreated, injured but not defeated. He didn't stop running until he reached the truck. Marcus's gear was still there, but his friend was gone. Chuck drove to the nearest town, his hands trembling on the wheel. He didn't call the police. What could he say? That something inhuman had taken his friend? Back in Seattle, Chuck couldn't shake the memory of those reflective eyes. He stopped watching cryptid videos. They weren't entertaining anymore. The forest held secrets, and he'd come too close to one. David Rambo had always loved the raw beauty of nature. Growing up in Detroit, Michigan, a city known for its industrial heart and vibrant music scene, David often found solace in the outdoors. The bustling streets of Detroit, the hum of car engines, and the rhythm of Motown were a stark contrast to the quiet, expansive wilderness he craved. As a kid, his family had taken trips to the nearby forests, where he learned to track animals and identify different bird calls. These memories stuck with him, instilling a passion for hunting and exploration. When his cousin James suggested a hunting trip in the dense swamps of Louisiana, David jumped at the opportunity. The plan was to spend a few days in the bayou, hunting wild boar and enjoying the humid, untamed wilderness. David packed light, but made sure to include a rifle, a sturdy knife, and a copy of Cryptids Quarterly, a magazine he had picked up at the airport. The latest issue had an article on skinwalkers, creatures from Navajo folklore. It was a chilling read, but David dismissed it as fanciful writing, fiction meant to entertain. The group consisted of David, James, and two other friends, Robert and Kyle. They drove deep into the bayou, their truck bouncing along uneven dirt roads. The air was thick with the scent of moss and stagnant water, and the sound of cicadas created a constant, buzzing background. Summer rains had left the ground soft and muddy, and the dense canopy above offered little relief from the heat. By their second day, the group had ventured deep into the swamp, far from any signs of civilization. The area was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or splash of water to break the stillness. That evening, they set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. A light rain began to fall, pattering against the tarp they had strung up for cover. The fire crackled weakly in the damp air, casting flickering shadows across their makeshift camp. As they sat around the fire, trading stories and passing a flask of whiskey, David couldn't help but feel uneasy. The swamp was beautiful, but oppressive, its silence too heavy. He glanced at the magazine in his bag, recalling the descriptions of the skinwalker, its ability to mimic voices, its unnatural speed and strength. He shook off the thought, reminding himself it was just a story. The first sign of trouble came when they heard a splash nearby, followed by a low, guttural sound. "Probably a gator," James said, though his voice lacked confidence. David stood and scanned the darkness with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the rain. Something moved just beyond its reach, a quick, shadowy blur. "Did you see that?" David asked, his heart pounding. "Yeah," Kyle said, gripping his rifle tightly. "It's probably nothing, right?" The group fell silent, straining to hear over the rain and the crackling fire. Then came a sound that made David's blood run cold, a voice, soft and pleading. "Help me?" It was faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the swamp. "Who's there?" Robert called out, his voice trembling. No answer, just the sound of movement. Closer now. David's flashlight caught a glimpse of something, eyes reflecting in the darkness, too far apart and too high off the ground to belong to any human or animal they knew. The creature didn't wait for them to react. It lunged from the shadows, its shape shifting in the firelight, long limbs, twisted features, and a terrifying, unnatural gait. The group scattered as it tore through the campsite, its speed overwhelming. David fired his rifle, the deafening shot echoing through the swamp. The creature shrieked and retreated, but not before grabbing Kyle and dragging him into the darkness. His screams were cut off abruptly, leaving the others frozen in horror. "We need to move now," James shouted, snapping David out of his stupor. Grabbing what gear they could, the remaining 3 men plunged into the swamp, guided only by the faint beam of their flashlights. The rain intensified, turning the ground into a treacherous mess of mud and water. They moved as fast as they could, but the creature was never far behind. Its guttural growls and rustling movements kept them on edge, forcing them to stop and listen every few minutes. They found a small patch of dry ground and lit a fire, hoping the flames would keep the creature at bay. Sitting in the dim light, soaked to the bone, David's mind raced. He thought of his family back in Detroit, his mother's warm smile, his father's quiet strength, and the way his younger sister teased him about his obsession with cryptids. He wondered if he'd ever see them again. Robert broke the silence. "What the hell is that thing?" It's not possible." David shook his head. "I don't know, but it's hunting us." Morning came slowly, the rain easing to a drizzle. Exhausted but determined, they pressed on, using a GPS to navigate toward their truck. The swamp seemed to stretch endlessly, every tree and shadow looking the same. When they finally reached the edge of the swamp, the creature attacked again, appearing out of nowhere. It lunged at Robert, its claws tearing into him before David managed to fire a shot that drove it back. Robert was badly injured, and they had to carry him the rest of the way. They reached the truck just as the sun broke through the clouds, the swamp bathed in an eerie golden light. David and James loaded Robert into the back seat and sped toward the nearest town, their hearts racing. They debated calling the police, but decided against it. What could they say? Who would believe them? Back in Detroit, David couldn't shake the memory of that night. He stopped reading Cryptids Quarterly and avoided any mention of skinwalkers. The swamp had taken something from him, more than just a friend. It had taken his sense of safety, leaving him with the haunting realization that some stories were better left unread. Robert Smith was used to the open plains of Wichita, Kansas, where the land stretched endlessly under wide skies and the winters were biting but familiar. A quiet life in Wichita was a comforting rhythm of predictability. Friday nights at the local diner, weekend bonfires with family, and the annual ice fishing trips with his childhood friends. But this year was different. His friend Chris had suggested they venture further out to the Ozark Mountains. Pristine waters, untouched wilderness, Chris had promised. Robert agreed, intrigued by the promise of adventure. The group, Robert, Chris, Ethan, and Mark, set out early one January morning. Their truck was packed with gear, ice augers, fishing rods, coolers, and enough provisions for a few days. The Ozarks, with their rugged peaks and sprawling woods, were a stark contrast to the open expanse of Kansas. As they drove deeper into the mountains, Robert noticed how the sunlight barely broke through the dense canopy of leafless trees, casting long shadows over the winding roads. The first day was uneventful but serene. They set up camp near a frozen lake, the sun glinting off the ice in a way that made the entire scene look like a postcard. The crisp air carried the faint smell of pine, and the occasional sound of a woodpecker echoed through the stillness. They drilled holes in the ice and spent the day fishing, their laughter cutting through the otherwise silent woods. By nightfall, they had caught enough fish for dinner and sat around a roaring fire, telling stories and trading jokes. It was around this fire that Robert's thoughts drifted to his family back in Wichita. His mother's habit of baking pies on cold afternoons, his father teaching him to bait hooks on lazy summer days by the Arkansas River. He smiled at the memory and thought of how they'd react to tales of the rugged Ozarks. The nostalgia was interrupted by Ethan, who brought up the local legends. "Ever hear about the Ozark Howler?" Ethan asked. his grin mischievous. "They say it's like a wolf, but bigger, smarter. Some kind of werewolf." Chris rolled his eyes. "Come on, man, we're not kids anymore." "I'm just saying," Ethan replied. "People have seen things out here. There are stories." Robert listened, remembering the articles he had read before the trip. Reports of strange howls, claw marks on trees too high for any bear, and glimpses of shadowy figures. He had dismissed it as folklore, much like the tales of Bigfoot or skinwalkers he had indulged in during late-night online rabbit holes. The fire burned low, and the group eventually drifted to their tents. The clear night sky glittered with stars, and the air was so cold it seemed to bite at their exposed skin. Robert woke in the middle of the night to a sound, low and guttural like a growl. He sat up, heart pounding, and strained his ears. Another sound followed, this one closer, a heavy, deliberate crunch of snow. "Chris?" Robert whispered, unzipping his tent. He emerged to find Chris and Mark standing near the fire pit, rifles in hand. "You hear that too?" Chris asked, his voice tight. Before Robert could answer, a howl ripped through the stillness, unlike anything he'd ever heard. It was deep, resonant, and carried a primal rage. The sound seemed to come from every direction at once. The others joined them, wide-eyed and shivering. Then they saw it. The creature was enormous, its dark fur glinting in the moonlight. It stood on two legs but moved with a fluidity that was disturbingly animalistic. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its claws were long enough to gleam like knives. The group froze as it stepped closer, snarling. "Run!" Chris shouted, firing a shot. The gunshot echoed through the mountains, and the creature lunged. Chaos erupted as the group scattered into the woods, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the dark. Robert's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the snow, the sound of snapping branches and growls behind him. He could hear Ethan scream, but he didn't dare look back. Eventually, Robert and Chris regrouped near a rocky outcrop. Mark was with them, his face pale and his hands shaking. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. "We can't stay here," Robert said, his voice hoarse. "We don't know where it is," Chris replied. "We have to find some kind of shelter." They stumbled upon a shallow cave and built a small fire, huddling close. The flames danced weakly, barely illuminating the space. The creature's howls echoed in the distance, each one sending a jolt of fear through Robert. They spoke in hushed tones, speculating about what it was and how they'd survive until morning. Robert's thoughts drifted again, this time to his younger brother back in Wichita. He remembered teaching him to ride a bike, and the way he'd look up to him with unwavering trust. He wondered if he'd ever make it home to see him again. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. When dawn finally came, they emerged from the cave cautiously, the cold sunlight offering little comfort. They followed the faint trail back to the lake, desperate to reach the truck. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound their boots crunching in the snow. As they neared the edge of the forest, the creature attacked again. It leaped from the trees, its claws slashing at Mark before Chris managed to fire a shot that sent it retreating. Mark was gravely injured, and they had to carry him the rest of the way. When they finally reached the truck, they loaded Mark into the back and sped toward the nearest town. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling on the wheel. They debated calling the police, but decided against it. What could they say? That a werewolf had attacked them? Back in Wichita, Robert couldn't shake the memory of that night. He stopped reading about cryptids and avoided trips to remote areas. The Ozarks had taken something from him. Ethan, a friend, and a piece of his courage. Some stories, he realized, were better left as legends.